Welcome to the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom. Today we will discuss a book that covers one of the most decorated U.S. military units in the war in Afghanistan and its 15-month ordeal that culminated in the Battle of Wanat, which was the war's most deadly. Here to describe his dramatic book, The Chosen Few, is our guest author, Gregg Zoroya. And welcome to our show.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here.
Our viewers should know that Gregg Zoroya is an award-winning journalist who works for USA Today in Arlington, Virginia. His book focuses on a single company of U.S. paratroopers calling themselves the Chosen Few, who arrived in eastern Afghanistan in 2007, hoping to win the hearts and minds of mountain people there. Instead, they spend the next 15 months in a desperate struggle to stay alive and were grossly outnumbered by the Taliban fighters. Just weeks before they were to go home, they fought their toughest fight, an estimated 300 enemy fighters versus 60 paratroopers. 9 Americans died and 24 were wounded on that day in July of 2008, one of the bloodiest battles of the war, yet not really publicized. Well, Gregg, how did you hear about the American paratroopers known as the Chosen Few?
Well, the last battle got a lot of publicity because it was very controversial. After that, when I went to Afghanistan, I've been there several times, I met the former battalion commander and was in touch with him. And as they began to award medals of honor to the members of Chosen Company, there were 2 awarded, I did stories and learned more about them and became very intrigued with their story.
Well, so you have, as a reporter for USA Today, had been covering military combat missions then.
I have. I've been to Iraq and Afghanistan both several times.
And what was the mission of Company C? What was their mission in this war in Afghanistan?
Well, at that particular time, they were trying to extend the reach of the Kabul government into the far reaches of Afghanistan. In Nuristan province, which is in the northeastern part of Afghanistan, is a very wild, kind of remote area. And there was an effort to try and push out into those areas, help the local populations to join the economy and improve themselves. But they also had to kind of push back against the insurgents who were out there. At that time, they weren't operating as difficultly as they weren't as dangerous as they were later. And so this meant pushing small bases of American troops up into the mountains to try to keep those insurgents at bay.
I see. Well, why was the Chosen Few a nickname for the C Company of the 22nd Battalion and so applicable to the young men in this company?
Well, nicknames for military units is a really kind of a historical part of the military, and they belonged to the 173rd Airborne. They were known as the Sky Soldiers. The battalion they were part of was called the Rock because of their exploits during World War II. And Chosen, C Company, like to call themselves the Chosen Few. They were very proud of that name.
And there weren't that many of them, actually, right? I mean, but they were being resupplied. I mean, there were more as they were dying. Others came to take their place, right?
Right. Well, when they began the mission, they were in an area where they didn't think there was going to be much problem. It was a valley called the Weigall Valley, and so they sent Chosen Company up there in a reduced fashion. They took away one of its platoons, and so it was a smaller than usual company when it deployed.
And what were the terrorist groups that the Americans were fighting in July of 2008 in Afghanistan? There were several groups, weren't there?
They were actually internationally operating terror groups, including Al-Qaeda.
Really?
Many of them were up there. They would use those mountains as a way to move between Pakistan and Kabul. And the mountain pathways that they used went right across the territory that the Chosen Few were working in.
And you wrote that a paratrooper never forgets his first jump or her first jump. Why? What is that like?
When I talked to these guys, the story was always the same. They went to jump school at Fort Benning, and they were there for 3 weeks. And it was a fairly simple program, but the first time that they opened those doors when they're up in that aircraft and they can hear the wind roaring and they move to jump out of there is something each one of them never forgets.
And how high are they? I mean, how high is the airplane at that
Well,
point?
it's what they call a static line jump, so they're probably about 12 or 1,300 feet. And when they leave the aircraft, that line, they're not free fall. The line pulls and they pop their chutes open immediately. So there's this incredible rush as they jump out, and then suddenly this complete silence as they float to the ground.
It has to be amazing. Well, the Chosen Few spent 15 months in a desperate struggle, living almost under constant attack. Can you tell us what their day-to-day life was like? Must have been so intense.
Right. Well, there were times when it was quiet. I mean, there were times when it was routine, but it was always unexpected. And so as it wore on, and the kind of the enemy commanders in that particular location, their main modus operandi was to build up their forces and launch kind of overwhelming attacks. And so they would kind of harass the troops with gunfire at periods of time, and then at in one particular point, just launch an attack of dozens of insurgents to try and wipe out small numbers of these Americans.
It was some of these chapters were hard to read. The violence was so intense. It was incredible. Well, what can you tell us about the personal lives and backgrounds of these young men? Were there things that they had in common?
Yeah, the one thing they had in common, which I found fascinating, was that many of them were from broken homes. I'm not sure that's necessarily a statement on the troops in the military, but in this particular case, it seemed like a disproportionate number of them, and I called them lost boys because they came from families where the parents had divorced or a parent had died, and many times their upbringings were difficult. They struggled, and they really found a family when they came into the Army and became part of the chosen company. I mean, these were young men who were their peers and who would defend them, and in some cases literally laid down their lives for each other.
Well, yeah, it was so moving, really so moving. And now, how did these young men come together during training to form such a disciplined fighting unit?
They were all looking for, I think, some adventure. They were trying to get away from some situations. They were looking for a new way to define themselves. But it was also the fact that this was a varied group. I mean, you had guys who had they had some of the senior non-commissioned guys who had been to combat 2 or 3 times. So they were real veterans. And then you had kind of the middle commission guys, the guys who were sergeants and staff sergeants who had been to war at least once. They had some experience. And then you had a lot of the young guys who had never seen war before, were kind of anxious to see it for the first time. And together they came and they really formed a unit. When they worked in Italy, and that was where the unit is based, in Vincenza, Italy. And so there was this kind of bond that developed because many of the people around there, obviously, they didn't speak English, and so these folks would go out together and kind of socialize together and really kind of grew together.
Well, I was amazed at how many of them had Italian girlfriends.
Right, exactly. Yeah, one of them.
Or Italian wives.
Right, right. Yeah, one of the young men met a girl on the bus and just fell head over heels in love with her, and ultimately married her before he went to war.
Yeah, that was really like something out of World War II or something.
Right.
Well, why did the media ignore the 3 distinct battles that the chosen few fought, do you think?
You know, it's interesting. I was always amazed by that. And as a writer, it was like a gold mine. I mean, there were these 3 key battles. The last one actually did get quite a bit of attention.
The Battle of Wanat.
The Battle of Wanat.
Yeah.
But the first 2, the first one was a battle by the enemy to overrun a base called Ranch House, and they nearly succeeded. The second one was a battle called the Ambush, in which they tried to wipe out a reinforced platoon of these guys, and again had either killed or wounded all the paratroopers in that attack, and those just were below the radar. They didn't get any attention, so it was like telling a story that no one else had heard about before.
Yes, it's a really compelling story. Well, can you describe these first 2 battles that didn't get very much attention? I mean, one was like an ambush, wasn't it?
Well, the very first battle was called the Battle of the Ranch House, and that was a battle of a base that it was built at about 7,000 feet on the side of a mountain. It was arguably the most remote military base in Afghanistan. It could be refueled and resupplied only by air, only by helicopters, and they had to struggle against thin air to get up there.
And they're clinging to the side of a mountain, basically, right?
It virtually is. I mean, it's about a 300-foot elevation from the bottom of the base to the top of the base, and the guys who would land there would be out of breath because they hadn't adjusted to the altitude.
Sure.
At one point, the enemy tried to, attacking from up above, literally tried to overrun and destroy it. And they captured about half of the base, and the fighting was very intense. And the one reason the Americans were able to prevail was because they called in an airstrike and asked the A-10 Air Force attack jets to do strafing runs inside the perimeter of the base, something that was virtually unheard of during this war. It had happened in Vietnam, but never before in the current conflicts, and they managed to break the back of the assault.
Yeah, it was intense reading this. Well, why do you think the Battle of Wanat is the only one of these battles that we've heard of? I mean, you feel like it's because that they people didn't know about it, right? Or was it just, or there weren't that many in the press that were interested, or what do you think?
Well, I think it was because of how many were killed and wounded. I mean, there were 9 paratroopers killed and almost 3 times that number wounded during that battle. So it was one of the bloodiest, if not the bloodiest battle of the Afghanistan war. And the parents were just overwhelmed by the loss. And one in particular was a retired Army colonel who just didn't believe this could have happened without some kind of terrible mistake by the commanders. And so he reached out to his contacts in the military and in Congress and initiated a series of investigations that ultimately led to a very provocative look into whether these commanders were derelict in duty. Ultimately, those commanders were cleared, but the publicity from that really kind of raised awareness about the battle.
Yeah, well, and that's in your book, and it's really amazing that he was able to get that battle investigated. And
Yes.
Well, what do you think these men learned from themselves in combat? What do you think they learned? Do you feel that they became very close, didn't they?
They did. They did. A lot of them had different experiences. I mean, some of them some of them were very religious, and it drew them closer to their faith because they saw things that were quite terrible, and they saw terrible things happen to their friends. Other ones became somewhat disillusioned because they couldn't believe this kind of that God would let these terrible things happen to them.
Right.
But overwhelmingly, they just developed these kind of, and it's been written about before, but this very strong bond. I mean, I think in many ways, in talking to them today, they look back at this experience as kind of the high point in their lives, their young lives. And they're still young men, but even though it was horrible and they had friends who were killed in sometimes terrible ways, they see it as a time which they almost wish they could go back and revisit. Some of them are contractors, some of them are still in the military, but I think they begin to realize that this experience, it was a solitary one that's come and gone.
Yes, yes. And like you say, it was one of the most decorated fighting units in America's modern wars. I mean, I read in your book that after 15 months of fighting, nearly 2/3 of the chosen few would be Purple Heart recipients. Can you elaborate?
Oh yeah, some of them received more than one Purple Heart. They were wounded, or in a couple of cases, they were wounded and then they were later killed. And of course, when they were killed, they also received posthumously a Purple Heart. Yeah, I mean the wounds were quite severe. Especially in the second battle of the ambush, where they were walking along a mountain cliff trying to make their way back to their base. And the enemy was in 3 different positions along the mountain trail and attacked them in a coordinated ambush. And they literally had to jump off a cliff to get out of the way and try to find cover.
It was so depressing to read. Right? It was so intense. And then also, 2 of them received the Medal of Honor for their valor in combat, didn't they?
Correct. Right.
And what can you tell us about those 2 men?
One of them was only 20 years old. He was a radio man, and it was during the Battle of the Ambush. He was the only one left actually ambulatory who could get around. He had dead and wounded Americans around him. He organized a defense with some help from some of the Afghan soldiers who were there, and really kept them going through the night before they were finally rescued. The other one was a sergeant in the last battle in Wanat, who was at one point was the only living survivor in this observation post that had nearly been wiped out, and he held them. He was very badly wounded. He fought despite his wounds, and until he was also rescued.
Yes. Well, Gregg, our viewers should know that you have traveled nearly 20 times into war zones in the Middle East and South Asia. I mean, where did you feel most vulnerable in terms of safety and getting out with your life?
Well, one thing that strikes me about those trips that I made, and some of them were, there were times when it was very scary, but I could always go home after my assignment, after a week or 2 with these troops. I'd go back to my wife, my children, and it was nice. These guys, these young men and women, which was one of the reasons I wrote the book, was they stayed. And these are volunteers. These aren't draftees. These are young men and women who choose to do this kind of thing. And each day they would put on their helmets and their body armor and lock and load their rifles, and they'd go outside the wires, they say, and did it without complaint. And I was always just so struck by that. And I think it's one of the reasons that I thought this was an important book to write, because these young men went through that experience and more.
Now, is this your first book?
It is my first book, yeah.
Well, it's a great beginning.
Well, thank you very much.
Great beginning. And it was also interesting to read that Sergeant Scott Beeson in your book was shocked to learn that half of the chosen company was on antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs. I mean, is this typical in the military today?
Well, during those war years, I mean, a lot of these guys had been through some severe combat before they went on this tour, and so the military was just learning how to deal with things like post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and so on, and just trying to get their mind around it. They still had a lot more distance to go in terms of learning about it and treating it. And so, yeah, it was a matter of trying to keep them, you know, in a fighting way, and in a fit, you know, mentally fit, and then sending them back into combat.
So it was not surprising that they were on anti-anxiety medicine, right?
As many as there were, correct, right. Yeah.
And you wrote that Ranch House was up on a huge mountain in Afghanistan at 7,000 feet, and the chosen company that had to defend it. This was not a welcoming land, was it?
The young soldiers really kind of learned to respect and love some of their senior NCOs, like the platoon sergeants. And in one particular incident, Matt Kaler was a platoon sergeant, was leading a patrol through a checkpoint. It was high up on a mountain at one point, and this is the middle of the night. The checkpoint was manned by Afghan security guards, which are your local men who were hired to give them jobs and also to keep them out of the hands of the insurgency. And as the Americans approached this checkpoint in the middle of the dark, they kept calling out that they were Americans, that they were coming in, and didn't get any response. Kaler took the point because he thought it might be dangerous, and as he got closer, they shot and killed him. And of course, the soldiers were devastated by his death, and also were convinced that the Afghans locally just couldn't be trusted.
Well, they were correct, weren't they?
Well, the official investigation deemed it an accident, but the soldiers themselves were convinced that it was otherwise.
Well, I was really struck as a reader by the portrayal of those Afghan soldiers that were supposed to be on our team, and yet they were responsible for a lot of deaths and injuries on our side.
Yeah, well,
it really struck me as...
The worst of it was in Wanat, where they had come there to work with the villagers, and when they were attacked that morning in July...
It was horrible.
It was a very bad situation.
Terrible, terrible. Well, now you say that you still keep in touch with the paratroopers, whose lives you chronicle in your book. Well, how often do you see them, you think, or talk to them, you think?
Well, I communicate with them. I mean, I've just communicated with a couple of them just recently. I think what I've tried to do is set up a Facebook page where I talk about the progress of the book and what's happening with it, and I tell stories from the book, and people seem to enjoy that. And it's become a place where they kind of, for many of them, it's kind of their own little proprietary space. And so one of them just was accepted to Harvard Law School, and he told me about that, so I posted about it. Others kind of monitor the page, and if anybody says anything that's untoward, they step right in and take care of it.
That's
so it's kind of a nice thing.
Now, well, you have covered the effect of war on troops and veterans issues for USA Today for almost a decade. And of all the stories you encountered, what made this one stand out so much that you wanted to write a whole book about it?
I think it was the fact that it was just a very powerful set piece. I mean, you had this kind of relatively small group of young men who were out there by themselves, and they fought against overwhelming odds at some point, at many points, and their grit at putting up a fight each time and keeping themselves alive and pushing back against the enemy was just such an amazing thing to watch at times when they weren't getting the air support they needed. They weren't getting the support.
They were really on their own, weren't they?
Yeah, and it was a real struggle.
And you also, it was interesting to read about the life in the barracks. You wrote that they had contests and life was an endless fraternity ritual, except that there were weapons lying around. What was the life in the barracks for the chosen few? What kind of contest did they have?
Oh yeah, I mean they would try to see who could smoke the largest number of cigarettes they could stuff into their mouth. I mean, they would capture scorpions and these large camel spiders and have them fight each other and kind of gladiator contests. They do what were like rave parties with glow sticks. I mean, they were just sometimes they put together. At one base in the ranch house where they had that steep slope, they did a zip line, which was kind of interesting, except that the surface below the zip line was mostly rock, and so if you fell down, it wasn't very pleasant.
Exactly. Describe the activities of Company C member Jason Bogar, who filmed Afghan children and edited videos of weapons firing to music.
Right. Jason was one of my favorites. He was such a talented young guy, and he had such an eye for
like
photography.
Like MTV type of producer, right?
Exactly. I mean, his still photos are beautiful as well. He loved to shoot the children, but he also was really good at. I mean, this was a time when soldiers could bring along on their laptops all kinds of editing equipment, and they could put together their own films, and they could cut and splice and everything else. And he became so good at putting together little documentaries on 2nd Platoon, which he's a part of, that he ended up doing one for the whole battalion because he was really talented at it.
That's great. And you wrote there were resentments and rivalries among the men in the chosen company, but everyone knew they depended on each other to stay alive, so their bond was unique. I mean, can you elaborate on that? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, these are like people anywhere. There's always going to be friction. Some guys would clash occasionally. I mean, one classic case was Jeff Mersman and James Takis. Takis was an up-and-coming non-commissioned officer who was being promoted, and Mersman was a guy who'd been through combat before, and there was some resentments. But when the time came, Mersman approached Takis and said, "Look, you're the boss. You're going to be in charge." Shook his hand and said, "I'm just going to do the best I can for you." So I mean, they pulled together because they had to.
Yes, they were very loyal to each other, weren't they?
They were.
And after reading your book, the question that comes to mind is why Afghanistan? And if we pull out, what about all the suffering and the victories will be for naught? I mean, for the chosen few who fought so hard in eastern Afghanistan, they lost all their positions to the enemy in Afghanistan. And is that still true today?
Yes, it pretty much is. Yeah. Yeah, the area they fought in is in the hands of the insurgents.
Does that upset them?
You know, they look at it in different ways. Some of them it does. I mean, for example, the last battle they fought in Wanat, even though they controlled the battlefield at the end of the battle, they were within a few days they pulled out and left the area. And so a lot of them felt very bitter about that. It's like, what were we fighting for? Others just kind of took a broader philosophical view that this is the way war works, and that you try to carry out the missions as best you can, and that it's more of a kind of a global thing, that you prevail in some places, you don't in others. So it was kind of a mixed.
Well, it was interesting in your preface. You did not make any judgments about. You just basically explained what they went through. You did not editorialize at all.
Yeah. Well, I kind of thought it was up to the reader to do that. I mean, the readers can kind of. I just wanted to see the facts, to see what these guys went through, what these men went through, and see it through their eyes, and then just kind of draw their own conclusions.
And then, of course, in reading your book, I was shocked by the disloyalty of the Afghans who are working for the military. I mean, can you trust an Afghan to work with the Americans when they've been so untrustworthy? I mean, I guess this still happens today, right?
Well, of course, it can be a much more nuanced than that. They had Afghan soldiers who worked with them who came from other parts of the country, and those guys could largely be depended on. It was the locals who they struggled with. And if you look at it through the eyes of the local people, they were being pulled in two different directions. I mean, the Americans and the Afghans that were the official Afghan soldiers would be there during the day maybe and come and visit them, but at night you'd have the insurgents come and warn them that they could be in trouble if they tried to work with them at all. So they were kind of caught between, and you could see why there were some betrayals.
Yes. And then the Battle of Wanat and the ambush are so well written that my heart was pounding when I was reading your book. The chosen company knew that they would be ambushed, yet they had to go forward. I mean, was this tough to write about? I mean, and to research? How did you do the research on this?
The hardest part about doing the research was that you would have a situation where you'd have 3 or 4 points of view, and you try to reconcile those and try to get the differences. And I explain at the end of the book that I did my best to try to pull the facts together. I went through all of it over with each of the fellows after I wrote that and did the best job I could. That was the toughest part, was just trying to find out in the heat of combat when there's so much happening just exactly who was where, and a lot of it's very detailed work. But it also was tough emotionally because you get to know these guys. You really, part of my goal was to try to breathe some life into the guys who didn't come home, because I couldn't interview them. I talked to their families and their friends, and I tried as hard as I could with that. So then when you see them gone, it's you miss them.
Yes, yes. Are there still some in the hospital today? Are there still some?
There's guys who are not in the hospital any longer, but they still struggle with their, some of them still have some physical issues, wounds. They still carry shrapnel and bullets in their bodies. Others have emotional problems that they've had to deal with through substance abuse, and it's been an ongoing issue. Others have moved on and are doing quite well. Some have become police officers, and others are still in the Army. One guy's a biological scientist out in California. The other one's going to Harvard. So it's a varied bag.
And so, are you at USA Today? Are you now covering what's going on in Afghanistan with the military?
Well, I've had a change recently. I've gotten brought onto the editorial board, so I'm doing opinion now, which is quite a change of pace for me. It's a little different.
Do you enjoy that?
Yeah, I do. It's a different form of writing, and,
Yes.
and now I'm telling people what to think. That's a little strange for somebody who's covered news, but I enjoy it.
Yes, I did want to talk about the fact that you that Battle of Wanat was investigated by the U.S. Army, and the findings were devastating, including poor planning in the execution of the platoon, the chosen few. They were ill-equipped to build adequate defenses.
I think what happened was a lot of things happened, and of course you can agree or disagree with the final findings where they cleared these officers. I think you have to kind of start from the understanding that the military was stretched thin. That at the time this was underway,
they had Iraq going on. Yeah,
they had a huge surge going on in Iraq, so that took a lot of resources away, and the whole region was operating with fewer aircraft,
Yes.
fewer artillery, fewer troops.
Well, there's so many things we could talk about, but we've come to an end. So where can our viewers find your book in Arlington?
Oh, well, it's at all bookstores. When you go in there, you can ask for it. It'll be on display. And also, you can find it on the book website, which is just simply chosenviewbook.com.
Thank you so much, Gregg, for being here and being a guest author on the Bookman's Corner.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Loved your book.
Thank you.
And thanks for watching. Please join us again next month for a new edition of the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom.